So I wondered, can we create a model of practice that is design-centric without being personality-centric? And what would be the power of such a model? When the profession of architecture started in the Renaissance, it was very central. But since modern architecture started in the 20th century, no one talks about beauty anymore. And if I looked at the history of modern architecture after independence, it was heavily influenced by Chandigarh. One is the language of design process, which you find in drawings and models and computer rendering. So the architect is really a translator between the language of design process and the language of experience. So actually when we occupy a space, it breeds memory into it. So can we design to facilitate this accumulation of memory?
And welcome back to ELEV8 Bengaluru 2026. We're about to begin an exciting keynote by architect Prem Chandavarkar of CnT Architects on the practice as a garden. Without further ado, let us take a peek at the flow of events for Day 2 of ELEV8 Bengaluru 2026. We begin with a masterclass by architect Prem Chandavarkar of CnT Architects titled The Practice as a Garden, followed by a panel discussion titled Beyond Sustainability, The Next Interior Shift, featuring Source Architecture, The Purple Ink Studio, B Spaces, RC Architecture, and Clinton Baptist. After which, we will have an informative masterclass by Suman Rodham and Kamakshi Vellore of Bamboo Pecker, titled Turning a Problem into a Resource, The Lantana Shift. Later at 3 p.m., we begin a panel discussion titled Color Matrix, Intertwining Form and Perception, featuring Design Boulevard, Nebulous Design Workshop Private Limited, DJ Designers, and JSW Dulux. Before we begin, we would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to all our valued brand and exhibitor partners, our experience partner JSW Dulux, our e-commerce partner RQ, our gallery partners LA Home, Designment, Kalaspurti, and Studio Nova. We also express our sincere appreciation to our other exhibitor partners whose participation has been integral to this event. Now, as we move forward, it is time to introduce the brilliant mind who has joined us today to share his invaluable insights and expertise. Prem Chandavarkar is the managing partner of CnT Architects, an award-winning and widely published architectural practice based in Bangalore, with a legacy tracing back to the city's first architectural firm. He completed his BArch in 1978 from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and went on to earn a research-based MArch in 1982 from the University of Oregon. He is a former executive director of Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design, and Technology, serves as an academic advisor and guest faculty at Indian and international architecture institutions, and is a member of the Advisory Council of the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum. Often describing himself as an architect easily distracted by other subjects, he writes lectures and blogs on architecture, urbanism, philosophy, politics, technology, education, the environment, art, spirituality, and cultural studies. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the stage. Welcome, sir.
Can we dim the lights on the screen? Yeah, that's better. So I'm going to be talking about the practice as a garden, and this is a courtyard in our studio. That building is where you enter from and has our admin and reception and conference. And this view is taken from the studio. There are service spaces to the left. And you enter this space also from a large open area with lots of mature trees. So you can say we're a practice in a garden. We are fortunate to do that. And I'm going to go the transition from there to thinking of the practice as a garden. And that's a journey I have to trace. So my talk will have three parts. One is the provocation of what set up the practice once I started running it. Then I will show some projects through that period since I was in charge of the practice. And then some questions that are coming up in the present and directions for the future. So to start with the earlier history, and it's a legacy practice. I didn't start it. So it dates back. Bangalore's first architecture firm started by Prem Chandavarkar in 1950. He passed away quite young in 1963, and Tara Chandavarkar and Pesi Thacker started a new practice in 1963. So 3 years ago, we celebrated 60 years of the so-called new firm. And a second generation joined between 1984 and 86. So I had as partners in that second generation Vasuki Prakash, Sanjay Mohe, and B. Surya Narayan. In fact, I was the last one of the four to join. And from 86 to 2003, we slowly started stepping into the forefront of running the firm. In 2003, the founding partners, Tara Chandavarkar and Pesi Thacker, stepped back from the firm. And then we discovered that they were the glue that had held us together, and we decided to part ways. It was an amicable parting. We're still friends. But suddenly, I had just been teaching at Srishti the previous 2 years, and I just come back into practice. So suddenly, what was then one of the city's largest architectural firms, I found myself running a small studio of just 5 architects, because they had taken their share of the projects and the team and moved into the separate firm they created, Mindspace Architects. So I had to reinvent the firm, and I faced a question: should I redefine it as a boutique practice since we are just 5 architects, or should I continue the legacy, which meant I should grow it? And I decided to continue the legacy. And I had to face the challenge of having a legacy. A lot of people would say to me, you had it easy, you had a ready-made practice handed to you. And yes, that was easier in some sense, but it was also more difficult. Because when you start your own practice, you can indulge your own desire. When you're continuing a legacy, you feel obliged to something greater than yourself. And that's quite a challenge. So I had to come to terms with what is the legacy and how do I extend it. And if I looked at the history of modern architecture after independence, it was heavily influenced by Chandigarh. And I studied in Delhi in the School of Planning and Architecture in the 1970s. And I was trained by that first generation who really worked in that Corbusian idiom. And I was struck by the fact that our firm actually never got into the Corbusian idiom. And I had to sort of come to terms with why that was so. And I realized that it was a different impulse over here. These architects chose the Corbusian idiom because they thought this represented, the independent India's modernity. CNT was actually not concerned about grand symbols of modernity, and I found it was a much more localized contextual response, which is why I called it the architecture of the background, where the impulse was to practice an architecture that earned you the respect and affection of the community within which you practice. So this is the legacy I had to try and continue. So I had to think about practice in a very sort of conscious sense. And I found that practice is a primary means by which architecture happens, but it's a inadequately researched and conceptualized form. And we have 2 anecdotal models that dominate. One is the creative personality, which you perceive as the cutting edge of the firm, and we tend to name individuals when we talk about that cutting edge. Or the idea of the practice as a business organization. And I felt that neither had served the profession adequately. The business organization is conceptually organized to talk more about business than architecture. It might produce a sleek architecture, but its primary orientation is commercial. And while there is no doubt that all these creative personalities have created some absolutely wonderful architecture, overall in the profession, it's bred a culture of heroes and imitators rather than a widespread, rigorous culture of reflection and creativity. So I wondered, can we create a model of practice that is design-centric without being personality-centric? And what would be the power of such a model? To do this, I had to think about the relationship between theory and practice. And there's a misconception that theory, you first have a philosophy and then you implement that philosophy in your practice. So practice is really applied theory. And as a consequence of this, we've actually split the two into different spaces. That we say theory belongs in academia, practice in the world of firms. And I think this has created a problem. Because to me, theory and practice cover the same territory but in different directions. Practice moves from the general to the specific. I start with something general like a design brief. I start coming up with a concept, then a schematic, then I start looking at its constructability, then I manage the process of construction, all moving more and more into the level of detail. And if I do nothing but that, my center of gravity as a person shifts to the level of detail. Theory does the opposite. Theory starts with a specific observation and then seeks to generalize it to a principle. And if I do nothing but that, my center of gravity as a person shifts to the level of abstraction, the ivory tower academic. So the two work best when they are contradicting each other within the same space. And when they are in the same space, theory disturbs the comfort zone because otherwise you get into the habit of practice. And practice lends an experiential foundation to theory, so you're not just in intellectual abstraction. So the relationship between the two is far more nuanced and complex than we tend to think it is. And the thing is, what kind of a team do you set up in this kind of organization? And the typical architecture firm, 80 to 90% of practices consist of less than 12 people. So the typical architecture firm operates on a very personal relationship because that many people, the person or the persons heading the firm can have a day-to-day intimate contact with everyone in the office. Now, you might have a commercial firm which grows large and the pyramid grows bigger. That means those who are at the bottom of the pyramid have very little connection with the person at the top. So you start creating a hierarchical, they become layers, middle managers, and you start functional and commercial protocols. So this is when you use the business organization model to scale up. But sometimes there is a creative head at the, and some practices have scaled up quite large. So Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, Terao Ando, all these people built up very large firms. So in that case, there's either an architectural language or a creative protocol, a research protocol, such as in Rem Koolhaas's practice, OMA, which then, so that's when you scale on the creative personality model. But the problem is you're still very dependent on this creative person at the top. And I saw an interesting film on Koolhaas's office, and they talked to one of the partners who said he ran the Manhattan office in New York City. And he said, Rem doesn't come there that often, but he's still that magnetic force. And no one really knows what will happen to the firm once he's no longer there. So he started thinking, what if we keep the intimacy of the small team, but we have several of them? And actually there's a horizontal protocol of exchange. So you're working in a richer environment, whereas if you just had your own small team and your own small practice. And as the firm grows, the number of teams grow. And so leadership attention goes to this horizontal connection and also how communication is happening vertically within each team. So we needed something to bind this with multiple teams. So we started setting up what we call beacon values. And a beacon is something you keep looking at occasionally. You can't philosophize every line you draw on an everyday basis. So it's like rowing a boat. You have to turn your back to where you're going to really row effectively. But every now and then you turn around and look at it to see, am I going in the right direction? So we came up with the first set of 3 documents. The first was the core of architecture, which started on a 1942 essay by an architect called Erno Goldfinger, who talked about 3 kinds of space. Pictorial space, which is 2-dimensional, best seen from 90 degrees, and you're outside it. The plastic space of sculpture, which is three-dimensional, can be seen from all directions, but again, you're outside it. An architectural space, which is three-dimensional, but you're inside it, which means you don't see the whole of it. So it has to have a structure and enclosure that you can visualize in your head. So whether it is a single space or a complex of spaces, you have to look at that spatial structure by which a person can have a sense of where they are. And this document expands on this a great deal. Then how is this meaningful? I go to design juries in architecture schools a lot, and I find that students often start with their presentation saying, this is my concept, or my concept is. So almost it's like it's their possession, and they are putting the meaning into the work. And I think that happens because the way we are trained, we're always next to the work talking about it. And then after we graduate, that voice of the architect is kept alive in architectural journalism, architectural criticism. So tends to be a belief that the architect gives meaning to the work. But actually, architecture is inhabited day after day, year after year. So if you saw something that the architect wanted to say the first day, you would get bored of it by the 50th day or whatever. So there has to be something more. So we don't see the inhabitant, it's just a shadowy figure. And in ancient Rome, the orators had to give speeches without paper to make notes. So they used the architecture of the space to remember what they were going to say. They'd say this column stands for the first point, this door next to it for the second point, the niche next to it for the third point. And they would memorize long, complex speeches that way. So this shows that we don't just receive meaning from architecture, we actively write meaning into it. And Primo Levi, in an essay on his own house, talks about the same technique of the ancient Roman orators and says this technique would have never worked in my own home because every corner is occupied by authentic memories which would interfere with the fictitious memories this technique demands. So actually when we occupy a space, it breeds memory into it. So can we design to facilitate this accumulation of memory? And you design very differently if you do that. So if I design a house right now, I start thinking of verandas and steps and niches and bookshelves and all elements which are sticky to memory. Then we conceptualize the practice as a place. So it has a set of individuals who are players, and each of them is on a learning journey. These individuals take actions, and the major actions are the projects that sustains it. But we also had forums, various kinds of discussions, workshops, etc., to keep that theory alive. And we also do research. And then these actions leave traces, and the major trace is the archive of the project. But we also take positions on certain issues. And then there is a philosophy, the beacon ideas and values that comes out of this. And there's a back and forth where each layer critiques the other. Then these were the first three. More recently, we came up with some criteria by which we judge projects. So it's like a project has to have spatial, tectonic, and ecological integrity. It has to have empathy with emancipation, with the inhabitant. It should emancipate the inhabitant and offer new possibilities for their life. And it should have a transcendent quality. And we want to work on a fifth beacon value on transcendence, but it's quite challenging, so this is still unformed and is a work in progress. A methodology that unites every project is that every project should have a proposition, which is not about architecture, it's an aspirational statement about life specific to the project. And then an architectural order we call the diagram. And the diagram should capture the proposition in a way that's intelligible to the inhabitant. So I'll take you through quickly through some projects that start from the time I was running the firm in 2004-05 and till the present. This philosophy actually evolved over a time, roughly between, say, 2004-2012. So the first is an international flower auction center. And this proposition took the spirit of the flower, which is a precise shape that hovers above a slender support. So we came up with the idea of these side walls dematerialized behind berms, and then you had these slender supports of steel tubular columns, and then just steel truss and metal sheet roofing, but creating these shapes that hover above them. And it is built into the topography of the site. So we analyzed how the site, the rocks, the trees, the slopes, all of that worked. And then we came up with an organization where this was one entry and all the warehouses were on this side, because this was the flat part of the site which had the least trees. And the buyers came in from this direction under this bridge, which connected the office and a cafeteria, and there was a bridge connecting the two. And the slope of the site here we used to set up the tiers of the auction hall. So these were some initial studies. And these are the kind of roof forms that resulted. So this is the warehouses, this is the auction hall, that's the office roof, this is the cafeteria. This is the entrance on the warehouse side, which has these there's one loading dock to unload the flowers and another loading dock where the buyers pick up the flowers. And here we had to carefully position it and preserve these trees so the trucks could reverse between the trees. And then coming around the corner, you start seeing the way the site slopes up with the office and the auction hall, and that's the cafeteria. And steps move along the side of the auction hall to the office, and these steps go inside to set up the tiers of the hall. And this is looking along the bridge. This is from inside the office. This is looking back towards the office along the bridge. And this is from the other side where the buyers come in and walk through the trees and go under the bridge to enter the complex. And a panoramic view of the whole project. The second is an office building for a software company in Hyderabad. And the challenge here is that the owner, in an office, the proposition is how to create a community of practice. And the challenge is that the owner was very particular about Vastu. So the building had to be this perfect square, 15-meter height. So how do you create a sense of community when you're forced to make a completely square building? So the diagram was, we scaled it down into quadrants, and each quadrant had an atrium in the center, and uniting the quadrants is a climbing staircase street that connects the entrance from the bottom of the northeast quadrant to the corporate office, which is on the top of the southwest quadrant, all driven by Vastu. And to design the street, we looked at the idea of step wells, specifically Adalaj, where you climb the equivalent of 5 floors without feeling it because there's so much spatial interest. So you put that effort into detailing the texture and scale, and there are these conference room bridges, glass enclosed conference rooms that span across the staircase. So this is then we also broke down the sense of the box by a lightweight skin that breaks the corner with a sort of Mondrian kind of grid on it. And this is the entrance, the main entrance at the bottom. And you come into this largest atrium, which is the quadrant, and the reception desk starts becoming part of the staircase, which goes up here and then turns the corner. And the idea of the quadrants is also reflected in a waiting area. And then you turn around and you come to this staircase. And in software companies, the population is quite young and people tend to sit on steps. So it is an active social space. Going back down, there's a water body, which is a focal element, the conference room bridge. And then each atrium has this next level of social space at the base and some planting and these balconies that overlook the atrium, which stagger. One is on this side, one is on this side, so they get double heights. And that's the outside that, as I said, breaks the sense of the box. We did a post-occupancy evaluation of this and found it was largely working as intended. And we were happy to see that even people going up to the third floor were more often taking the stairs than the lifts. This is a corporate headquarters for Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, one of India's top pharma companies, also in Hyderabad. Here they were not so particular about Vastu, but we still follow the idea of a community of practice. And it was a 1.5 acre climbing, steeply sloping site. So we created this social spine that goes up down the middle. So you have a conservatory cum reception, an amphitheater, which is a gathering space for everyone, and then a cafeteria. So it's actually divided into 3 office blocks, which are connected by bridges. So every block gets an internal view into the spine and an external view. So that's the entrance, and that conservatory glows like a jewel in the crown at night. And so that's the conservatory reception you enter into. And then you start moving through that spine up the stairs and you come to this amphitheater. And you see how the offices also look down here. And the amphitheater is enlivened by a juice bar, juice and coffee bar. And this is a spill out space from the cafeteria at this upper level. We put some inspirational sayings onto the steps of the amphitheater. And this is a waiting lounge before entering the cafeteria. And that's the cafeteria which opens out into a small outdoor garden space. We did the interiors also. So this repeats across floors, these workstations, but this color stripe changes according to which block and which floor you're on. And each of these quadrants, centers on a sort of common space where they have shared resources like printers, a digital notice board, trophies this team has won. So each quadrant has a sense of center. And there's an open space where initially they thought they'd make an expansion, but fortunately they preserved it as a park. This is a software campus for Mindtree in Bhubaneswar, which is both a centralized training center and software production. And the proposition we looked at was the earth, the sun, and the community, because there were 2 protected landscapes, a hill to the east and a reserve forest to the west. So we had an axis connecting the sunrise and sunset, and what we call the street of friendship, which was a path that connected all the blocks and went through the middle of the hostels of the training center. This is the academic block, and these are the 2 software blocks. And we created a large rainwater harvesting pond. So that was the visualization of the project. That's the pond that was created, and the earth that was excavated was used to make mud blocks. All the walls are made out of mud blocks. So this is the entrance. When you enter the site, this main security, and there's an arcade which leads you down into the site. And then you come to this space, and this is the main reception. That's the hill that I talked about. That's the arcade. So this is the academic block, that's the security, the main reception, and this is the spine that connects to the hostels. That's from the reception looking at the hostels. The academic block is a 2-story building that centers around a courtyard which is roofed but skylit and open at the end, so it channels the breeze going through. So it's a comfortable space at all times. And you come into an amphitheater first and then come into this courtyard. So that's the entrance, and then you come to this amphitheater, which works as an informal social space for small training sessions or a gathering place when the chairman comes to visit. And then you come into this courtyard, which is quite lively when a training session is going on, and there are always people sitting around here doing their project work between sessions. And the furniture is all movable, and the patterns in the carpet create the clues as to how to arrange the furniture. So depending on what's happening in the classroom, you move things around. This is a cafeteria at the basement level. And the hostels are based on these clusters where you enter an atrium and you have four rooms, twin sharing rooms around a common work and living space and with a balcony. And the atrium at the base connects to the spine of the hostel. So this is the entrance, some views from the outside. You see the balconies. So these louvers change position depending on the orientation. And then you come into the lobby, which is quite large because on the first day of training, some 500 people turn up. And there is a spine which connects game and social facilities to one side and a set of courtyards on the other side. And here also we create these spaces where people tend to gather. The hostel is designed around this atrium, and at the top of it, there are these solar chimneys, which are metal and glass that heat up. So hot air is naturally drawn up and escapes through these louvers. So actually create a natural stack ventilation pattern where some evaporatively cooled air is fed into the rooms that finds its way through vents into the common living dining and then into the atrium and then out to the top. So we avoided air conditioning. So with fans, the people survive. So you see the atrium here. Yeah, this is the atrium, which is the one level of socialization. At the base, it connects to the main spine. It has things like table tennis tables at its base. And then you come into the shared living and workspace. And then this is the typical room. So you see how the air is fed through these vents. It finds its way through these louver cuts and then into the atrium by these louvers at the top. This is the academic block with the cafeteria at its base. So actually there are two levels. There's an entrance level and there's this level, which connects to the adjacent software block. So the software block, so this is the academic block. So from the cafeteria, you can walk on and connect at the lowermost level, and you come to the base of the amphitheater. But at this level, you can come and you connect to the first floor level. So there are two axes. There's a cross axis through the amphitheater that connects to the main spine that connects the sunrise and sunset. And in the other direction, there's a sort of linear stair that connects a meditation terrace and a water body visually. So these are some initial visualizations. These three trees were the only trees on the site. So we planned this atrium all around it. And this is the completed building. Unfortunately, this company fell victim to a hostile takeover halfway through this construction. So unfortunately, we got sidelined out of the project. But you can see that those trees were preserved. This is a house we did in Nelamangala. And here the idea was to connect the sense of nature and the earth. So there's a visual axis there's a large rock, a swimming pool courtyard, then the family and living are sort of transparent spaces, and there's an access through the garden that sees a lake. This was initially planned as water bodies too, but was later changed to planting. So that's a swimming pool courtyard. And this is on the other side where you get the step terraced landscape. And it eventually expresses these set of hovering roofs which get accentuated, especially at night. a shelter for destitute women for the missionaries of charity. And here we wanted to create the sense of a healing and convivial landscape. So we used existing trees and designed the building so that it created these courtyards where the trees were, and the building sort of wound its way around. And there's a chapel here at its entrance. It's just a two-story structure, partially built on the upper floor. So it's a simple, austere, white form in the middle of the landscape. And that's the entrance. That's the chapel. And one of our architects painted this picture of Mother Teresa, and these are the palm prints of the first set of residents of the place. The interior of the chapel. So it's a very simple, austere form, and then these are all the courtyards that are created. So all the corridors open onto this set of courtyards. And you can see from the courtyards into the building and from the building into the courtyards. And it's even from the first floor, you have a view looking down into the courtyards. This is the toilet, so even it was a very low budget building, but one can still make something nice even when it's a low budget. Going to the other end, ultra luxury project in Hyderabad, a 50-story apartment tower. And we wanted to give this layering of community and domesticity here. So actually the main tower is lifted 12 meters off the ground, and traffic is confined to a very small portion of the site. One road on one side has a direct entry into the basement. So actually the podium is largely pedestrian, and because the building is lifted off the ground, you get a transparent landscape through the building. And then we layer the apartment also, where there's first a core you come into that contains a lift lobby and fire core. Then you come into a threshold which has a foyer and a formal living where you can entertain people without disturbing the family, and the entrance into the service areas of the house. Then the heart of the house, which is a joyous space which contains the dining, the guest room, the family room. And most apartments are confined to a single height, but here we create a double height space we call the angan. And this flips on either side of the family living. And there are only 2 apartments per floor, so you get really a through view here. So that's the sense of the double height angan that you create. And then you get the bedrooms at one end, which also focus onto a public, more private family space, which can be set up as a home theater or a family living. So that's the plan that results. So this cutout is the angan of the lower floor, and on the next floor, this angan will shift to this side. And this is where the building is lifted off the ground, so you get this transparency through into the 2 lobbies. There's again another transparency through here, which has these pods where you can sit and social space, or you can work over there also. And then there's a 2-story gym at this end. And there's a separate clubhouse, which is like a jewel in the crown. And vehicular traffic only works in this zone. The rest of it is totally pedestrian. So that's what the building looks like. The structure is complete. It's still under construction. Finishing has started now. So here you see how it's expressed in the facade, the double height space, how it alternates. And that's the clubhouse, which has this crafted metal skin, which will glow at night. This is the entrance space where it's transparent through. You enter these lobbies on either side. And the kind of landscape that occurs all around. This is that area with those pods, which is a social cum working space. And the last project is a rural project. It's in Chodapalli, which is in rural Andhra. And it's a center for the study of consciousness. There's a spiritual teacher called Sri M. And he's actually a very simple person. If you meet him, he doesn't have the trappings of a guru or some special clothes or anything like that. He just dresses in everyday clothes. One day you'll see him in a mundu, next day you'll see him in jeans and t-shirt. And so we wanted to pick on that idea of simplicity. So he said, we'll do an absolute minimum over here. We'll just keep it very simple. And the site works on a central axis which connects a library, which is where you can come to study not just M's teaching, but many other spiritual masters. And there's an axis that goes through a sacred grove, an open space with a banyan tree, and a meditation hall. And you can walk through here. And then you get a dining hall that opens onto a wellness center on one side and this banyan tree court on the other side. And from the wellness center, there's a court which runs into a medicinal garden that makes the herbs of the wellness, the Ayurvedic medicine. And then there's a series of cottages around that. And the entire rear portion of the site is retained for agriculture, growing fodder for the cows in a goshala. There's a mango tree plantation here, and they grow vegetables here with a rainwater harvesting pond here, and the overflow from that feeds into a well that was existing on the site. And eventually, this is not done as yet. There'll be a parking and an amphitheater to hold events on special occasions like Guru Purnima. And the other idea was to just have these simple structures that just mediate light. So with verandas and the outside, you get this gradient of shade from outside to the veranda to the inside. So that's an aerial view. This is the wellness center. That's the dining. That's the meditation hall. This is the path along the edge of the sacred grove, and you see the first of the one of the cottages here. There's some cottages yet to come up in future expansion here. This is an area that contains the staff and support areas for the wellness center. That's the goshala, the rainwater harvesting. That's the mango tree orchard and the other agriculture orchard. That's a fodder ground. So the main library had this existing building on the site. It used to be a silk farming area, and that was where they used to deal with the silk, take apart the cocoons. So we wrapped it with a veranda. And this is the entry from what will eventually be the parking. And that leads on to, the veranda wraps around to a courtyard and there was another existing building which we preserved, which contains the offices and some space for volunteers to stay. So that's a central courtyard which contains a lily pond and then a katte so small satsangs can also be held in this courtyard. These are the typical cottages. There are 2 rooms attached in one structure, again, each with a veranda both in the front and the rear side. And there's this hill, which you can't see it in the slide, but there's a temple at the top. So that's also a strong presence on the site. Some more views of the cottages. This is the dining hall, which has the wraparound veranda. On this side, it opens. This is the path leading to the wellness center, and the other side to the meditation hall. And you can sit out in the veranda too. And that's the meditation hall, which has this traditional Kerala roof, which vents at the top. And it has verandas on 2 sides, one looking towards the mango orchard, which is the side you're seeing here, but the other towards the banyan tree and the sacred grove. So this is the path on the edge of the sacred grove that leads to this tree where the banyan tree has just been planted, it's yet to grow. The interior of the meditation hall and how it relates to these verandas on either side. The wellness center has this large courtyard which looks onto the medicinal garden. And it has these subsidiary courtyards on either side, one which contains the treatment rooms and the other which contains rooms to stay. The cottages are largely for people who come on retreats to attend the library, but people who come for a wellness program stay in this building. So you get this view through. And the hill has a strong presence, and you get these spectacular sunsets over here. And then you can also walk out where there's no building, where the rainwater harvesting pond is, where the agriculture is. So it's very simple, but it's very serene. And what I was very heartened to hear recently, Sri M's main ashram is in Madanpalli, which is about a half an hour drive from here. And last Guru Purnima, they put up a lot of people here at this place who wanted to stay. And there were 80 people staying on the site. And I met one of them, and she, even with 80 people there, she said it's such a serene place. So coming to the questions at the present. And one was, I think, this transcendent community that I had imagined at the beginning hadn't fully materialized. And I think that was because people are suppressing their personality, saying there's these CNT values, etc. And the idea of the diagram sometimes created an abstraction rather than a tectonic crafting. And because each team was doing its own thing, it created some operational inefficiencies. So on the human side of it, we keep doing these workshops, and there's one workshop where I'll show you one result. But basically, we had 6 teams, and the idea was each team adopted a project that some other team worked on. And then they had to create a mythic story about the project, just invent one on their own. And then they had to act out that story to the rest of the office. Then the team that worked on the project had to reclaim the project with this new story, and then talk about how they might reimagine the project. Now, these last 2 stages didn't work out that effectively, and I won't go into that, but the first 4 stages actually produced some very interesting results. And I'll just show one of them, which was this competition we had entered, which we didn't win, but anyway, it was, and it was a site that had a lot of trees on it. So we broke the program down into 3 buildings, and each component was shaped in both plan and section by the position and spread of the trees. So in the story this group enacted, it was the story of the trees on the site. And it begins with a conversation about, we hear something's going to happen here, what's going to happen to us. And then one tree is declared too sick and too old, so it's cut down. Another tree is healthy but is transplanted to some other part of the campus. And then they pulled 3 people from the audience to stand amongst them to represent the 3 buildings that were constructed. And then they told the story of a bird that flies down one day and starts talking to the trees. And in talking to the trees, she finds that while they've been preserved and they stay there, their identity has changed. And they start looking at their reflections in the glass of the buildings, and they start becoming more self-conscious and having individual identities rather than merging into the identity of the grove. And the only tree that does not change is the people tree, because she is sacred and people build a shrine at her base. So I thought this kind of, sort of poetic freedom was something that we needed to unleash, because people were suppressing their personalities. And if we did this, we could bring in some of the immeasurable aspects of what architecture must be. And the unmeasurable is something we don't have the capacity to speak about. If we talk about what's valuable in our lives, we'll say things like love, joy, beauty, curiosity, wonder, laughter. You'd be hard-pressed to define them, but you know them as reality when you experience them. So they can only be known experientially and talked about poetically. So I think the spirit of the story was something we had to bring in. So we tend to just look at the hat we wear as architects and not look at the fact that there's a human wearing that hat. And we need to privilege the human within the practice. So we tend to say there's a design practice which has professionalism and all these things. And then there's a human foundation, but we tend to draw a line between them. We say one is personal, one is professional, and we don't merge them. So what if we treated that human foundation as the foundation for what the practice should be? And I was moved by an essay by Joseph Rickwert where he talks about design as an act of translation. And he says that two languages that you find in the practice. One is the language of design process, which you find in drawings and models and computer renderings and other simulations, physical models, etc. But there's a language of spatial experience, and that's a completely different language. It's an embodied language. So it's actually, the architect is really a translator between the language of design process and the language of experience. And then Rickwert makes an interesting point that we tend to privilege our fluency in design process. But good translation requires a greater fluency in the language you're translating into rather than the language you're translating from. If I'm translating a poem from English into Hindi, I need enough English to understand and appreciate the poem with its nuance, but I must be a masterful poet in Hindi. So we privilege the wrong fluency, and we don't put attention into the experiential, unmeasurable, and developing our fluency in that. And if I look at what happens in that process of how we come together and think about these things, and there's a table in the center of our studio which is quite often used for very serious discussions. This is a picture of one of our workshops. But at other times it converts into a table tennis table. And in fact, there's a tournament going on in our office right now. So the fact that the table can play both these roles is an important thing. That it brings in that sort of human dimension to what we are. So I have found that over the years since I'm running the practice, the overarching question has changed. The first question was, what is architecture? I kept thinking about that. Then when I first started running the practice, I started thinking of what is my practice. But now it is changing to, and it's not that the old question goes away, it's just that the access to the old question is different. So I first think about my practice and then use that to think about what is architecture. But now I'm thinking about who is my friend in my practice. Because what is unmeasurable, I can only verify and affirm in conversation. And what kind of conversations can we have that affirms this? So this is about friendship. What is my practice is about collaboration. And eventually we use that to create art. And friendship reflects joy. Collaboration requires how we affirm joy, and the art must give joy a very specific form so that we can tangibly see it. So actually the model we're looking at is a model where we are like 6 offices under one roof, and we have 6 team leaders, and we're encouraging each of them to think about their work as though they're running their own practice. And we ask them to think about what is motivating that from within. And there are 3 practice leaders who are also doing their own thinking about what is coming from within. And there's some sharing across the team leaders on what their projects are, and sharing amongst the practice leaders also. And what relates these 2 levels is a relationship of stewardship. And this is we've started what we call a design stewardship program, and this is very recent. It started like 2 weeks ago, so I don't have any results to offer you. But stewardship means feeling responsible for caring about something. So we don't manage the teams. We have to care about them, and we have to be responsible for how they flower. So basically, this comes to the point of the practice as a garden, because we have to work on the practice like we would work on a garden. That each plant has its own life, so the garden as a whole cannot be controlled in any detailed sense. At the most, it can be nurtured through the accumulation of small daily acts of love. Some parts must be allowed to run wild. Weaving this all together is not just communication, but communion. Communion is when you can connect beyond words. You feel You feel you're part of the same thing, the same space. And the whole quest is to align with the authenticity that is greater than our own. And what we're really doing is we're seeking to pursue beauty. Now, beauty is a very old-fashioned word. Actually, when the profession of architecture started in the Renaissance, it was very central. But since modern architecture started in the 20th century, no one talks about beauty anymore. They'll talk about society, they'll talk about all kinds of things, but no one talks about beauty. And when we talk about beauty, we tend to, come up with some construct like the golden mean or something like that. And I don't mean to say this is not important. It is important. But eventually, beauty is experiential. And we need an experiential definition of beauty. And the best one I've come across is by this German philosopher called Gernot Bohm, who said, beauty is that which mediates to us the joy of being here. So the question is, what is this here we are creating? And we need to create an architecture that offers us this here. But I don't think we can create it unless our practice is also a joyous space of affirmation and friendship. And it is also creating this here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for continuing the legacy of Bangalore, the Garden City, through your designs. We now open the floor for questions. If you have one, please raise your hand.
Okay, I'll leave the person with the mic to decide who gets to ask.
That was a very good presentation for that. So, in your projects, there is one coin, one side wherein the architecture is minimal. It's completely open courtyards, and there are a few projects which are high-rise with glass. And even the Reddy's project, though there is a courtyard, it's covered. The ground is, I think, marble thing. So, do you accept both as equal, or do you try to pitch in to the clients who are wanting that glass facades? Do you try to pitch them saying, can we not use glass? Can we do something else? Or something like that, and keep it minimal? As in, we are in net zero event. So, do you think about that, pitching that net zero concept into your clients?
Yes, we do. Of course, with varying degrees of success. We had one project which I didn't show because it is a very large project, taken up too much time to explain, but it's a 170-acre campus for Indian Institute of Management in Trichy. And of course, it's very low density, so one could do things, but we created and we had the opportunity there. We created 6 acres for water harvesting ponds. So the campus is self-sufficient in water. And they got a government grant to build a 1 megawatt solar plant, which is around the edge of these lakes. So as far as possible, we try to avoid doing full glass buildings. Occasionally, we've been forced to it, but we're not very happy about those cases. But we try and scale it down. But one of the things that we look to is to look at the human scale. That core of architecture, that architecture you inhabit, and you have to have a sense of where you are within your, within the architecture. So like doing a full glass building removes that human scale. The historical buildings did it well. They would break the facade down to elements where the smallest element, you could say, that looks like it's 2 people high and 5 people wide. And we try and do that. So even in a 50-story building, we try and not to have the same thing going top to bottom. And we've used what is actually a service floor and a lounge that comes in the middle of the tower to scale the height. And we created the sense of the base, the sense of a top. So we try and give some sense of scale. So even when you're outside, you can get a rough sense that my apartment is somewhere there. And then we look into the layering of the site and the layering of the apartment and all of that again to give that scale. So we do seek to do work towards sustainability. Uh, we're trying to, we're in the process of evolving a sort of more concrete policy on that. And in that policy, we talk about two dimensions of sustainability. So one is the quantifiable dimensions, but we also say there's an unquantifiable dimension of sustainability, of feeling that you're part of the earth. So, for example, we're doing apartment building which is under process now. It's also quite high, it's 35 floors. But we are doing the base using the concept of a mandala, not as a sacred diagram, but as a structure of attention. So we have an atrium with control light where there is something more inward and a water body, so you get the sound of. And then when you turn outwards, there are 4 thresholds that open in the cardinal directions. And then we try and use that orientation as this way of moving out. So the north threshold is where you enter from. So there, that leads less protection. So we have and each of these thresholds is double height. So we create this glass that you look out onto, and there's a entrance courtyard and plaza, and there's a feature wall and a fountain behind it. The east threshold, we look at the fact that the sun is coming at a very low angle. So we try and see how the ground plane lights up and close. So we're looking at flowers and trees. We want to work with a landscape architect which like glow when they're on the ground, when the east sun is hitting. And in the threshold itself, we're looking at a brass pattern that will pick up this. The west threshold, similarly, but the spectrum of landscape will be different. The east threshold is more, we're looking at flowers that are more on the blue-green and the cooler spectrum. And in the west threshold, the warmer spectrum. But the west threshold is also the main entry to whatever landscape the place has. And the south threshold is like an ending, because you can't really walk out from there because the basement entry is just outside it. But we are looking at creating some kind of jali pattern that we look at the angle of the south sun, and we look at how on the floor of the threshold it creates a shadow pattern. So there's an awareness of being in the earth and the cosmos, and we're looking at ideas like working with this organization called Daily Dump, which has these kits where you can do composting on an apartment balcony. So we want to, and this client is receptive to all these ideas. So we try and bring in this. You want to look at both the quantifiable and the non-quantifiable dimensions. And we don't look at it just in terms of green ratings, because ratings just look at what is comparable across projects. So it has an inbuilt bias towards systems and technologies and products, and does not incorporate what design can do. And 80% of what you can do is at the level of design. So yes, we look at it with varying degrees of success, but we are concerned about it, whether it's large or small.
Thank you.
Sir, I would be interested in knowing what is your way of conceiving a concept, and how do you convince the client, and how do you meet midways? At the same time, what do you think is the best alternative for glass facades?
What's an alternative to glass is a very general question. We'll do it with just what's appropriate to that project. I believe a facade should reflect both orientation and plan logic, and not be treated as a design exercise by itself. And then it should relate to human scale. And depending on that orientation and the circumstances of that site, I will choose my materials accordingly. How do we start a concept? We draw. And drawing is not. See, a concept is not a sort of linear logic where you say, first I do this and then I do that. You draw something, and when you draw, you don't philosophize every line. So it's just a tacit, spontaneous thing. And then after some time, you stop and you step back and you look at it and say, did I do something good? And the philosophy comes forward, the practice goes by. Then you pick up a pencil again and again, there's a reversal. And you keep doing that. And what you're really doing is creating a space for a conversation, where the sketch acts as a conversation between design and you. And you're trying to look at that act of translation, trying to think of it in terms of experience. So you try, and that you can't visually assess, that you have to do it in a sort of sensory imagination of what your body is and what it's doing. And you just do that as a process with rigor and commitment, and sometimes things are accidental also. I remember hearing a lecture of Charles Correa who says everything doesn't happen in this logical format where he says you're sketching something and then you put a piece of tracing on top of that and you sketch an alternative. And then you reach for your coffee, and when you reach for your coffee, your elbow accidentally shifts the top tracing a bit, and you look and say, hey, that's a good idea, so those kind of things also happen. But eventually you've got to get moved by it at a very primordial level of experience. And when you present to the client, you have to show that you are moved by it. And you have to present it in a way that the client also gets moved by it. And the language you use is important. And this is something that was part of my training as a legacy of the practice. The earlier generation said, when you're talking to a client, never say, I think. Because then the design becomes your possession, which puts the client on the defensive. You say, don't you think? Then it becomes a shared thing that's on the table between both of you. So you have to build this relationship with the client, which is, let's share an exploration and show that you are excited by it, and therefore infect the client to be excited by it.
Thank you, sir. To mark this moment, I would like to invite architect Asya Bayani, co-founder of the Architect's Diary, to felicitate our esteemed keynote speaker. Thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am, for this special moment of recognition.